They called it the arsenal of democracy, but it looked more like a city that never slept. Detroit, 1942. The air was thick with the scent of oil and steel, with sparks falling like orange rain from the catwalks above. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, a few miles north in Warren, was alive 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, no weekends, no silence. The clang of steel against steel was the heartbeat of the war. Inside, men and women moved like a single organism, welders, riveters, machinists, foremen shouting over the thunder of cranes. The temperature near the furnaces could melt the soles off boots. Overhead, banners hung from the rafters. Every tank you finish, a life saved in Normandy. A woman named Alice Corman wiped sweat from her neck with an oil rag and muttered, "We weren't building cars anymore. We were building vengeance." Her words would later appear in an oral history decades after the war, but in that moment, they were just something said to fill the noise. A few months earlier, the same workers had been assembling Cadillacs and Chryslers, symbols of comfort and prosperity. Now those same production lines forged M3 Lees and, soon after, M4 Shermans, the tanks that would crawl across Europe, push through North Africa, and grind into the heart of Germany. The line foreman, an older man named Red Hastings, had been a machinist since the Depression. He'd built everything from steering columns to kitchen appliances, but nothing like this. You could feel it, he said. Every inch of steel that passed through your hands. You knew it was going to someone's son. The plant was vast, sprawling across hundreds of acres. Trucks came and went day and night, their tires slick with frost in winter, dust in summer. The windows glowed orange through the fog, and from the highway, it looked less like a factory and more like a volcano, its molten core hammering out weapons for a world on fire. Every department worked on its own miracle. In Foundry B, men poured molten steel into molds that glowed white-hot, shaping armor thicker than any automobile chassis had ever seen. In Assembly 3, women in rolled-up sleeves and bright scarves welded turret rings and mounted machine guns, their faces hidden behind dark visors. In paint, the air was sharp with the smell of lacquer, the color olive drab number 9. At the entrance, a sign read, "Keep it moving, lives depend on it." And they did. The conveyor belts ran faster than they were meant to, each section timed to the second. If one bolt jammed, the whole line stopped, and every worker knew what that meant. Delays at the front, delays in survival. A military liaison from the Army Ordnance Department, a captain in a crisp uniform dusted with soot, watched the chaos with something between awe and disbelief. "You people run this like a battlefield," he told the plant superintendent. The superintendent, Walter Ruther, didn't smile. "It is one." But there was something else in the air besides urgency, pride, and a kind of fear. Everyone knew the stakes. For the soldiers fighting overseas, victory meant living another day. For the workers here, it meant not letting them down. A letter pinned to the break room wall summed it up. "Dear folks in Detroit, I was in a Sherman built by you when we broke through at El Alamein. It saved my crew. Keep them coming." It was signed simply Private James R. U.S. Army. The workers read it during their 10-minute coffee breaks, the words smudged from so many hands. One man folded it into his pocket and said, "That's why we don't stop." And they didn't. The arsenal's rhythm never faltered, day bleeding into night, night into day. Even the sirens that once signaled shift changes were silenced. They were wasting too much time. Lunches were eaten beside the machines, under the hiss of welding torches and the metallic percussion of hammer strikes. When snow fell that winter, it melted on the roofs before touching the ground. The heat from the furnaces rose into the clouds, glowing faintly like a beacon. A journalist from Life magazine who toured the plant described it as a cathedral of steel, with prayers made of noise. To outsiders, it was chaos. To those inside, it was faith. By the end of 1942, Detroit Arsenal had produced its first 1,000 tanks, a number so vast that the British liaison on site reportedly said, "The Americans are trying to outbuild time itself." But behind the optimism was exhaustion. Accidents grew more frequent. A crushed hand under a falling plate, a welder's mask catching fire. No one left the line unless ordered to. "You got hurt," one worker said later. "You wrapped it and kept going. Somewhere, a boy might be waiting on that tank." Even at midnight, the cafeteria was full. The jukebox played swing music, half drowned by the sound of machinery through the walls. Some nights, soldiers on leave stopped by just to watch, standing in silence at the edge of the floor, as if the factory itself were a kind of front line. The war was far away, but every spark felt like gunfire. And then came the challenge, one that made even the veterans of the plant go pale. An order arrived from Washington, 500 tanks per month. The superintendent read it twice, then said nothing. The workers glanced at one another. They were already running at full capacity, men falling asleep beside the presses, women fainting from heat, and now the government wanted more. The foreman lit a cigarette with shaking hands and said what everyone was thinking. "They want an army," he muttered, staring at the paper. "And they want it yesterday." But there was no choice. The war didn't wait for exhaustion. And in that moment, a voice rose from the back of the room, an engineer with steel dust on his collar and a half-broken pencil in his pocket. He said it quietly, but everyone heard. "Then we'll build one." The room went silent. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered, "He's crazy." But the man didn't flinch. "A whole tank army," he said, "faster than the enemy can destroy it." And before dawn, the furnaces roared again. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We need 500 tanks a month. You have 60 days. Army Ordnance Memo, February 1942. The message landed like a bomb. Inside Chrysler's headquarters, cigarette smoke hung thick over the conference table. Blueprints, supply charts, and production schedules were spread like a battlefield map. Snow fell outside, muffling the city, but inside there was only heat, from tension, from fear. 500 tanks. Someone muttered. They want miracles now. Chief Engineer William Newberg read the memo twice. He'd spent his career designing car engines, not war machines. He knew the math, 30,000 parts per tank. Steel, engines, gears, each demanding precision and time. 60 days wasn't a schedule. It was a death sentence. He exhaled. "It's not a factory anymore," he said quietly. "It's a front line." No one disagreed. The next morning, the arsenal erupted into motion. Trains arrived from Pennsylvania and Ohio, carrying steel and rubber. Trucks rolled through the gates before dawn. Inside, welders worked in the glow of torches while loudspeakers blared, "Speed is the weapon." Posters covered every wall. "A Sherman a day keeps Hitler away." But the plant was breaking under pressure. Gearboxes cracked. Paint peeled. Armor plates arrived warped. The first 25 tanks came off the line, and 14 failed inspection. The press called it Chrysler's folly. One columnist wrote, "You can't build tanks like cars." They were right. Tanks weren't cars. They were monsters of torque and armor, half machine, half endurance test. The night shifts blurred together. Mechanics slept on benches. Women in denim overalls worked 12 hours without stopping. The cafeteria stopped keeping time. Meals came when you could grab them. Then, one evening, a woman collapsed beside her press. 26 years old, dead from exhaustion before anyone could carry her to the infirmary. For a moment, even the machines went silent. Then the foreman gave a nod. The belt started again. By March, the Army threatened to pull the contract. Newberg gathered his engineers in a freezing office above the assembly line. "We're losing the war before the tanks even leave the floor," one said. Newberg looked down through the glass at the chaos below, men welding hulls, others fitting turrets, track crews 50 yards away. Separate jobs, all waiting on each other. He turned back and said, "Why are we waiting for one tank to finish before starting another? Blank stares. What if we build in sections, modular? Every team builds a piece. Then we join them together at the end." A pause. Then a whisper. "You mean build the tank like a jigsaw?" "Exactly," Newberg said. "And we make the line fit the idea, not the other way around." It was madness. It was also their only chance. By April, the arsenal transformed. Floors torn up, new tracks laid. Flying repair squads patrolled the aisles, fixing machines without stopping the belts. Workers learned on the job, teaching each other faster than manuals could be printed. 3 shifts became 4. The smell of oil and metal filled the night air. Women passed wrenches silently, their faces streaked with soot. Men shaved in buckets of cold water and went back to work. And slowly, incredibly, the chaos turned to rhythm. In April, 380 tanks. In May, 512. The Army inspectors, once skeptical, began to watch in awe. One night, Newberg wrote a short letter to Washington. "We have found a way. Give us 3 months." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. At dawn, a new Sherman tank rolled off the line. Its paint still wet, its engine roaring like a living thing. The workers stopped to watch. Someone began to clap. Then another. By the time it reached the gate, the whole plant was cheering. Newberg stood apart, exhausted, his coat stained with grease. He didn't smile. He just whispered, "Now we build faster than they can burn." And in those 3 months, Detroit rewired the very idea of war production. They built not just tanks, they built a factory that could build itself. By the spring of 1942, the Detroit Arsenal was no longer a plant. It was alive. The floor vibrated with a steady heartbeat of machines. The air shimmered with the heat of welding arcs and the faint tang of oil and metal dust. Even the night shifts felt bright, flooded with the orange glow of furnaces and the blue crackle of electricity. The new modular assembly system had turned chaos into rhythm. Each section of the plant became a living organ with its own pulse. Turret teams, hull welders, track fitters, gunners, all working in perfect timing. The belts moved like arteries, carrying life through miles of concrete and steel. Every 55 minutes, a tank rolled off the line. That number, written in an Army inspection report, sounded impossible. But the inspectors saw it with their own eyes. The massive M4 Sherman tanks gliding forward, each one assembled, tested, and painted in less than an hour. The workers didn't cheer. They didn't have time. There was always another to build. Even the sound had changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was a rhythm, steady as a drumbeat. Welders kept time by it. The cafeteria clock was set to it. A worker once said, "If the arsenal stopped humming, I'd think the world had ended." Inside the paint bays, women sprayed the tanks olive drab, their faces masked, their gloved hands trembling from the vibration of the nozzles. The smell of lacquer mixed with diesel. One of them, Rosie Tompkins, said later, "Every tank I painted, I imagined my brother inside." In Assembly Section 7, the foreman taped a note to the wall. "Each rivet is a bullet. Each shift, a battle." They meant it. Accidents still happened, but no one left their post. If a machine jammed, repair squads crawled under moving belts to fix it while the line kept running. The phrase "stopping time" became taboo. Detroit had learned to turn exhaustion into speed. At night, when the snow outside turned the streets white and silent, the arsenal still burned like a furnace. The windows glowed orange for miles, and the smoke rising from the stacks carried sparks that drifted across the city. From downtown, people said you could see the sky pulse. The workers joked that they didn't need sleep, only coffee and faith. In the break rooms, tin cups rattled against metal tables while jazz played from the radio. Someone had written, "Take 5 for victory," above the jukebox in chalk. It wasn't just Detroit anymore. Across America, other plants were rising. Shipyards in California, bomber lines in Kansas, steel mills in Pittsburgh. But the arsenal was the model. Engineers from across the country came to see how Chrysler had done it. They left with notes, sketches, and one recurring phrase in their reports. They built the machine that builds the machines. And it kept evolving. The first generation of M3 tanks was being replaced by the M4 Sherman. Faster, stronger, more reliable. When one tank broke down in testing, engineers redesigned the part overnight and sent a new version to the front within a week. Nothing was static. One of the military overseers wrote in his report, "They fight the war like mechanics, not soldiers, but their courage is the same." There was truth in that. The workers' faces were burned from sparks, their hands swollen and blackened by oil. They traded stories about letters from the front, soldiers thanking them for the tanks that had pulled them out of hell in North Africa or Sicily. One letter hung above the main entrance. "To whoever built tank #M4-20341. She carried us through the desert and home again. You saved 5 men's lives." The next morning, someone pinned a hand-drawn sign beside it. "Let's build one that saves 10. Everywhere in the plant, small acts like that kept people moving. When morale dipped, the foreman walked the aisles reading telegrams from the front. When a new shipment of armor arrived, the horns sounded, and the entire floor cheered. When word spread that Hitler had called America a nation of mechanics, one worker shouted over the din, "Then let's build him a nightmare." By the end of 1943, The arsenal employed over 75,000 people, men, women, immigrants, even teenagers from trade schools. The plant had its own power station, fire brigade, hospital, cafeteria, and daycare. It was a city under one roof. At full capacity, it produced 28 tanks a day. The Army estimated that without Detroit's output, the Allied advance in Europe would have stalled within months. But no one at the arsenal knew that. They just worked, hands raw, ears ringing, hearts steady. And yet, beneath the rhythm, a shadow grew. There were whispers that Germany had unveiled a new tank. Heavier, faster, more lethal than anything on the field. The Tiger. It could pierce a Sherman from over a mile away. When the rumor reached Detroit, someone scrawled it on a breakroom wall. "They've built a Tiger." Underneath, in grease pencil, another hand wrote, "Then we'll build a Lion." And that night, as the line kept moving, the engineers began sketching something new, something that could meet the Tiger head-on. By 1943, America was building one tank every 63 minutes. The Detroit arsenal no longer slept. Even at midnight, the sky pulsed orange from the furnaces, and the city around it beat to the same metallic rhythm. Inside, the temperature hung above 100 degrees. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. Sparks fell like golden rain, settling on the oil-black floor. In the welding bays, workers wore goggles and masks not to keep out disease, but to breathe through the haze of molten steel. Radios nailed to the walls hissed with swing music, Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, a strange soundtrack to war. Between songs came the voice of the announcer. "Keep him rolling, Detroit. Don't rest till he rolls." Helen Curtis, a 24-year-old riveter, wrote home to her mother in Indiana. "We work 12 hours a day. I dream of tanks in my sleep. When I close my eyes, I can still see the sparks. They float like fireflies." Outside the main gate, vendors sold coffee to the night shift. Soldiers on leave stopped to watch the endless parade of Shermans rumbling onto the freight trains. One every hour, polished, fueled, stamped with a serial number and a promise. To Europe. Each tank took 25,000 parts from over 400 different factories. Bolts from Ohio, optics from New York, tracks from Illinois. The arsenal was the beating heart, but the veins reached across an entire continent. It wasn't just speed. It was evolution. Engineers replaced the old armor plates with new alloys that saved tons of steel per unit. They redesigned the engine mounts to shave an hour off assembly time. Every small invention meant more machines on ships, more steel against tyranny. A sign above the tool crib read, "Minutes mean miles. Miles mean lives." By midsummer, Detroit was outproducing the entire German Panzer Corps. For every tank Hitler built, America built 3. And yet, no one at the arsenal saw themselves as heroes. They were tired. The kind of tired that seeps into bone. Some hadn't had a full night's sleep in months. Still, they worked. Helen remembered one night when a thunderstorm rolled over the city. Rain hammered the roof so hard it drowned out the music. The power flickered once, twice, and then the backup generators kicked in with a roar. The workers cheered and kept welding. Not a single line stopped. It wasn't Detroit versus Berlin, Helen wrote. It was time versus death. In August, the first Sherman from their new production run reached the front near Monte Cassino in Italy. It was photographed beside the ruins of a monastery, the word Michigan stenciled in white on its side. A week later, the tank was gone. No one knew if it was destroyed, captured, or simply swallowed by the war. A month later, more arrived. Dozens. Then hundreds. Each departure from the arsenal was treated like a silent funeral. No ceremony, just a low whistle as the train pulled out, carrying the work of 10,000 hands toward an invisible enemy. Engineers began experimenting with faster-drying paints, new gearboxes, reinforced treads. They learned to cut inefficiency the way soldiers learned to shoot, by necessity. In a single year, production time for a Sherman dropped by 40%. The Army called it the miracle of Detroit. Inside the office, factory manager Harold Nystrom pinned a world map to the wall. He marked each front with red pins where Shermans had been sighted. Sicily, Tunisia, Italy, France. "That's us," he told the night foreman. "That's our reach." The man nodded but didn't smile. He knew what the pins meant. Somewhere, someone was driving his handiwork into hell. When the shift whistles blew at dawn, the workers stepped out into the heavy air, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. The morning sun turned the factory windows to fire. From far away, the arsenal looked like a volcano, a place where the earth itself was forging weapons. A soldier visiting from Washington toured the line and shook his head in disbelief. "You're fighting a different kind of war," he said. "No," replied the foreman. "Same war. We just fight it with wrenches." That summer, Detroit produced over half of all American tanks, more than 14,000 machines. Together, the U.S. built 29,000 in a single year, triple Germany's total. The arsenal alone accounted for nearly half of that number. Every clang of steel in Michigan echoed as an explosion in Europe. Every turn of a wrench was a line on a map moving east. By autumn, the noise had become so constant that workers said silence felt dangerous. Helen described it perfectly in one line. "When the plant stops humming, it feels like the world has stopped breathing." But then, the telegrams began to arrive. At first, they were quiet rumors. Tanks burning too fast. Shells punching through armor. Crews trapped inside. The words spread through the break rooms like smoke. One morning, Newberg, the engineer who had once said, "This is a front line," stood by the main door holding a cable from the War Department. The message was short, typed in all caps. "Tank losses heavy. Request review of armor design." He read it twice, then folded it and put it in his pocket. The whistles blew. The machines roared. The line kept moving. But that night, for the first time in months, the sound of the arsenal seemed to falter, as if even the steel was listening. Because from the front had come a single warning. The tanks are burning too fast. They built them faster than ever. But the soldiers called them death traps. Autumn, 1943. The letters began arriving like ghosts. Thin, mud-stained envelopes addressed to the Chrysler offices in Detroit. Most were never meant to reach the men who made the tanks, but a few slipped through. And once they did, they spread like wildfire across the factory floor. A letter from Italy read, "We love the Sherman for what it does. We just wish it loved us back." Another, signed by a crewman from the 756th Tank Battalion, was worse. "We burned inside her. Tell the boys in Detroit to make her stronger." The mood in the arsenal shifted. The same workers who once cheered every departing train now stared at the photographs pinned to the bulletin board. Charred hulks of Shermans, turrets blown open, the serial numbers still visible. Some of them had built those exact tanks. In one corner of the design office, a young engineer whispered, "They're dying in machines we made." By October, the rumors had become reports. Official memos from the front described catastrophic losses against the new German Tiger and Panther tanks. The Tiger's 88mm gun could pierce a Sherman from over a mile away. The Shermans, with thinner armor and a shorter gun, rarely survived the first hit. A.U.S. Army Field Note summarized the problem in one sentence. "Armor insufficient against 88mm fire." When Newberg read it aloud to the production board, no one spoke. Outside the window, the sound of the assembly line rolled on, steady, relentless, indifferent. That night, a foreman gathered his shift and read one of the letters aloud. No speeches, no music, just the words of a dead soldier. When he finished, the workers stood in silence for a full minute. Then, without being told, they went back to their stations. The machine started again, but slower, almost careful. One woman, Helen Curtis, wrote to her mother, "I used to feel proud. Now I just feel responsible." The guilt spread through the plant like oil on water. Every clang of a hammer sounded heavier. Welders checked seams twice. Painters repainted serials by hand. A new motto appeared on a breakroom wall. "If it burns, we failed." The Army's technical teams arrived within weeks. Engineers in pressed uniforms walked the floor beside men covered in grease, arguing in half-sentences over blueprints. The verdict was clear. Detroit would have to rebuild the Sherman from the inside out, while keeping production running. It was an impossible order, again. But this time, no one laughed. The modifications began immediately. The designers introduced a new type of steel armor, layered and sloped to deflect shells instead of resisting them head-on. They strengthened the turret ring, replaced the thin fuel lines, and rerouted the exhausts to reduce the risk of fire. The biggest innovation came from a quiet metallurgist named Frederick Hall. He proposed storing ammunition inside sealed water jackets. Wet stowage, he called it. If the tank was hit, the surrounding water would keep the shells from detonating. Most people thought he was crazy. until they tested it. It worked. The risk of explosion dropped by nearly 75%. When the results came back, someone scrawled on the lab wall, "Make every tank a survivor." There was no pause in production. Every new design, every new part, every modification was folded directly into the line, as if the plan itself were evolving. You could walk from one end of the arsenal to the other and watch the Sherman transform with every step. Old hulls at one end, new armor gleaming at the next. Still, the letters kept coming. Some angry, some grateful, most haunted. One was from a sergeant in France. "Tell your people not to stop. Even when we curse your tanks, we know, without them, we're dead before we fight." The engineers pinned that one beside the time clock. It stayed there for the rest of the war. For the workers, the fight became personal. It wasn't about quotas anymore or patriotism. It was about keeping men alive, strangers they would never meet, fighting inside the machines they built by hand. Helen said it best in a later interview. "We stopped building tanks. We started building promises." The pace quickened again. Every improvement fed another. Stronger armor led to heavier engines. Heavier engines required better cooling. The plant turned into a chain reaction of innovation and fatigue. In the drafting rooms, the air smelled of graphite and coffee. Engineers sketched through the night, sleeping on blueprints spread across the floor. One of them, a soft-spoken designer named Robert Burns, wrote in his journal, "It isn't metal anymore. It's conscience." By early 1944, the new Sherman models were ready, tougher, faster, and built for survival. The Army called them the M4A3 and M4A3E8, the Easy 8. To the workers, they were something else, redemption on tracks. But no one celebrated. Not yet. Because in every office and workshop, people knew what was coming. The rumors had been circulating for months, a massive invasion, somewhere across the channel. One morning, the plant manager walked through the aisles and looked at the endless rows of tanks waiting to be loaded onto trains. He stopped beside one, resting his hand on its armor. Someone had scratched a word into the paint with a screwdriver, "Home." He smiled faintly, then turned to the crew. "Get it ready," he said. "This one's going first." And somewhere, across an ocean none of them had seen, those tanks would soon meet the beaches. June 6, 1944, the day the steel from Detroit touched the sand of Normandy. Engines roaring, waves breaking, and for a moment, America itself came ashore. Dawn, June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Gray skies. Wind that smelled of salt and cordite. In the surf, steel monsters crawled forward. Hundreds of M4 Shermans, their treads grinding against the sea floor. The men inside could barely see. Water poured through the cracks. Radios hissed with static. Engines screamed under strain. One soldier later said, "It felt like riding a furnace into the ocean." Some tanks never made it. The water was too deep, the waves too strong. They sank in seconds, vanishing into the surf with only a few bubbles to mark their graves. Others hit underwater mines, the explosions turning them into instant coffins. But the ones that survived, those reached the sand and kept going. At Omaha, Juneau, and Sword, the Shermans clawed their way through barbed wire and smoke. German fire tore into them, shells bursting against the armor like thunder. But the new models, the ones Detroit had built through sleepless nights, held. The wet stowage kept the ammunition from igniting. The new armor turned aside hits that once would have killed everyone inside. A tank commander wrote in his logbook that night, "We took 3 hits today, still rolling. Tell whoever built this, thank you." Another soldier remembered ducking beneath the hatch and seeing a small engraving welded inside the turret, "Detroit." He smiled through the noise. "For the first time," he said, "I felt someone had my back." Behind him, waves kept spitting up wrecks, half-buried tanks, twisted landing craft, the floating dead. But for every Sherman that burned, another rolled forward. They crushed through dunes, over trenches, into villages. One broke the German line near Vierville-sur-Mer, a single tank forcing open a road that let thousands of men pour inland. And just like that, the tide turned. Across the channel, in the Detroit arsenal, it was still dark when the news broke. A radio in the supervisor's office crackled to life. Allied troops have landed on the coast of France. The night shift froze. Tools stopped midair. Then the plant whistle blew, one long, piercing note that echoed through every hangar. Workers dropped their wrenches and began clapping, shouting, laughing through tears. Some hugged, covered in grease. Others simply stood in silence, eyes on the ceiling, as if listening for the distant sound of the tanks they had built crossing the sand. Helen Curtis, the riveter who had once written, "I dream of tanks in my sleep," wrote another line that morning. For 2 years, we built ships of steel for men we would never meet. Today, they came to life. The arsenal didn't rest. Within hours of the D-Day broadcast, production accelerated again. Replacement parts, spare engines, crates of treads, everything labeled urgent, France. The workers called it the second invasion. By July, word filtered back through the War Department. The Shermans were holding their ground. They weren't perfect, but they were everywhere, swarming across Normandy's hedgerows like iron bees. German soldiers began calling them the locusts. Each tank carried the memory of Detroit, the welders, the machinists, the women in goggles. Soldiers began sending fragments of armor back to America. Pieces of hulls signed with messages like, "She got us to Paris." One letter, preserved in the Arsenal archives, came from a young corporal named John Carver. "Your tank saved us on the beach. Every inch of steel you hammered was a heartbeat out here. We ride with you." At night, the Arsenal workers listened to the war bulletins over the factory loudspeakers. The same announcer who'd once shouted, "Keep him rolling," now read casualty lists in a solemn voice. But amid the loss, there was pride, deep, quiet, unspoken. For the first time, the war machine felt human. Each clatter of a track, each grinding gear in France, was tied to a heartbeat in Michigan. The line between worker and soldier blurred. The Arsenal wasn't just feeding the war anymore. It was part of it. When Paris was liberated in August, the plant held a 2-minute pause. Not for celebration, but remembrance. They'd built more than tanks. They'd built bridges of steel between two worlds, one burning, one surviving. The next morning, as the line restarted, someone hung a new sign above the entrance. "The road to Europe runs through Detroit." But even as victory drew closer, whispers began to spread through the management offices. Contracts were shrinking. The government was already planning for post-war adjustment. And in the same halls that once shook with the thunder of creation, a quieter battle was about to begin. The fight to keep the Arsenal alive after the war it had helped win. Because the war wasn't over for Detroit. Not yet. On VJ Day, the line stopped for the first time in 4 years. And the silence was louder than the war. August 1945. Sirens in the city wailed for joy instead of shift change. Outside the Detroit Arsenal, workers poured onto Mound Road as if released from a spell, goggles lifted to foreheads, gloves hanging from belts, faces streaked with soot and tears. Some shouted, some kissed strangers, some just sat on crates of bolts and stared at their hands, as if unsure who they belonged to now. Inside, the conveyors froze mid-crawl. A half-painted Sherman hung over the floor in a sling, a last unfinished sentence suspended in the air. Cameras caught the celebrations, paper hats, flags, men dancing on flatbeds. But the close-ups told another story. Exhaustion so deep it looked like grief. The plant had been a heartbeat that never missed. Now the chest was still. A welder unhooked his mask and listened for the hum that had lived in his ears for years. When he didn't hear it, he swayed as if the room had tilted. "I didn't know quiet could hurt," he said. The notices arrived almost immediately. Handbills tacked to locker doors, memos slid under office glass. Demobilization schedule. Stand by for reassignment. A line on the bulletin board, typed in cool army font, felt like a verdict. Tank production to be reduced by 95% by year's end. In the women's restroom, a small crowd gathered around a single sheet of paper stapled to the corkboard. "Return to domestic work. Thank you for your service." Someone laughed, too sharply. Someone else folded the notice and put it in her pocket like a wound she didn't want seen. A riveter named Helen read it twice and said, flat and stunned, "I built tanks. Now they tell me to bake pies." All that week, the plant sounded like a church after a funeral. Footsteps echoing, voices careful, tools placed down instead of dropped. Crews unbolted jigs they had once worshipped. Cranes lifted fixtures onto flat cars bound for storage. In the drafting room, blueprints for new armor were boxed and labeled obsolete. One foreman peeled a motto off the wall, each rivet a bullet, and folded it into his lunch pail, the letters cracking like old paint. Outside, the city erupted into parades. Inside, people learned how to stand still. The cafeteria closed early for the first time anyone could remember. No one lingered over coffee. They wandered the aisles as tourists in their own lives, pointing at the places where they had bled and laughed and sworn and become necessary. A machinist traced the outline of a wrench on his bench with a fingertip, the oil dark under his nail. "What do we do when nobody needs saving?" he asked no one. Orders shifted overnight. A new schedule appeared: conveyor retooling, civilian chassis, farm equipment, refrigerators. The same hands that had tuned turret rings now measured door hinges. A test cell that once shook with V12 engines hummed meekly with washing machines. The first time a white enamel appliance rolled where a tank had, men clapped out of habit and then stopped, embarrassed by the smallness of the sound. Pink slips came folded like letters from the front, used to, tidy, and lethal. Most went to women. Rosies turned back into first names. Some pinned their ID badges beside family photos and walked out without looking back. Others lingered by the gate, unable to cross the invisible line between urgency and afternoon. On payday, the parking lot felt too big, the air too light. The war had taken weight from shoulders. Peace took purpose from hands. A few tried to celebrate anyway. A band set up by the loading dock and played jitterbug tunes the floor used to drown out. Couples danced between crates and laughed at the way their feet remembered while their heads did not. When the song ended, the echo rolled through empty bays and returned as a kind of question. The arsenal did what it had always done, adapted. The casting pits cooled. The foundry ladled steel for bumpers, not armor. Tool rooms cut dies for chrome instead of tracks. The company men called it conversion, neat and patriotic. On the floor it felt like moving into a stranger's house. Same walls, different heart. At home, the noise was gone too. Husbands returned from the Pacific and found wives who could read blueprints and fix a jammed press. Wives returned from the line and found kitchens that felt too quiet, too clean. In the middle of the night, some woke to phantom whistles and reached for boots they no longer wore. When the noise stopped, Helen wrote in a postcard to a friend, "We realized it had kept us alive." One Saturday, the final wartime Sherman was winched onto a flat car under a sky that finally looked like weather, not smoke. The men who guided it down raised their hands and didn't cheer. A photographer asked them to smile. They tried. The picture made the paper with the caption, "Victory's Last Tank." In the margins, someone penciled a truer line. "And now what?" Across management desks, new numbers whispered a different kind of threat: foreign competition, shrinking contracts, margins thin as shavings. The plant that had learned to outrun death began to learn how to outrun arithmetic. A superintendent closed his ledger and stared at the quiet floor. "We won," he said, and the words sounded complicated. The whistle blew at 5. It didn't mean go faster anymore. It meant go home. Men and women stepped into a sunset that smelled like cut grass instead of hot steel. Behind them, the arsenal exhaled and went still, an animal tamed by victory and left to pace its cage in memory. But history wasn't done with Detroit. The next war would be economic. By the 1970s, the arsenal of democracy was covered in rust. The gates on Mound Road sagged under their own weight. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the loading bays. What had once sounded like thunder, steel, hammers, engines, now echoed as wind through broken glass. Detroit, the city that built the tanks that saved the world, was crumbling under a war of its own. Factories closed one by one. The auto giants that had ruled the century began to bleed jobs overseas. Men who once built armor now stood in unemployment lines. The same calloused hands that welded freedom could no longer afford to fix a roof. From the air, the arsenal looked like a battlefield after the smoke cleared: twisted cranes, abandoned rail lines, and silent assembly halls. A reporter in 1974 wrote, "You can almost hear ghosts clocking in." Inside, the air smelled of oil and memory. A single guard walked his rounds past machines wrapped in plastic like corpses. A faded sign still hung over the main floor. Keep M rolling. Its edges curled, its promise broken. The veterans of the line came back sometimes, just to look. They'd park by the fence and sit in their cars, engines idling. One man, a retired machinist named Robert Burns, stood at the gate in a clean shirt and said softly to the guard, "This was our battlefield once." His voice cracked on the word was. In the city, the collapse spread like contagion. The big three, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, cut shifts, outsourced parts, and shuttered plants. The same streets that once pulsed with night shifts and swing dances turned into empty lots and boarded-up diners. A former welder named Helen Curtis, the woman who had once said, "I built tanks, now they tell me to bake pies," was now in her 60s. She lived 15 minutes from the arsenal, in a house with peeling paint and a humming refrigerator, the kind her factory made after the war. When a young journalist asked if she ever missed the noise, she laughed. "Miss it? Sometimes I still hear it," she said. "Only now it's in my bones." Detroit itself became a mirror of its greatest creation, built strong, hit hard, still fighting. But the enemy this time wasn't across an ocean. It was neglect, economics, time. Archival footage from 1979 shows protest lines outside the old arsenal fence. Dozens of men in worn jackets hold cardboard signs, "Save our jobs." A voice from the crowd shouts, "We built the machines that won the war, but we couldn't save our own city." The camera pans over the gates, locked and rusted, and the wind carries the sound away. A former engineer, gray-haired now, points to the factory roofs and says, "It's strange, isn't it? We learned how to outbuild death, but we never learned how to outbuild time." By 1985, much of the complex stood empty. Rats, pigeons, and the occasional historian were the only ones left walking the halls. Rain leaked through the rafters onto the same floors where Shermans had once rolled, fresh and gleaming. The echo of footsteps no longer matched the rhythm of machines, just the sound of memory pacing its cage. Still, there were traces of life. In one forgotten office, someone found a drawer full of ration books, coffee coupons, and a stack of yellowed photos. Women in goggles, men in coveralls, smiling beneath a sign that read, "Every tank a victory." Their eyes looked right into the camera, unaware that the victory they were building would one day outlive their city. In 1996, the inevitable came. The last remaining section of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant officially shut down. A short notice ran in the Detroit Free Press. "Arsenal faces closure. End of an era." No crowds gathered this time. No bands played. Just a few old workers in their Sunday coats, watching the final trucks haul away the equipment they once worshipped. One of them left a note on the chain-link fence. Written in pencil, it read, "We did what we were asked. We made history. Don't forget us." Years later, when the fence itself was torn down, the paper disintegrated, but the pencil marks, pressed deep into the metal, stayed visible for a while longer. The Arsenal's fall wasn't just the end of a factory. It was the end of belief. Belief that industry could be immortal, that victory could last forever. They defeated Germany, but no one taught them how to defeat time. And yet, beneath the rust, the steel still remembered. If you drive down Mound Road today, you can still see it. The curve of a wall, a gate, a sign that once read, "Detroit Arsenal." Most people pass without slowing. They don't know that beneath the asphalt lies the ground where America built its armor, where fire and noise once forged history. The smokestacks are gone, the rail lines cut off, but if you stand there long enough, just stand still, the wind still hums like distant machinery. The old main building has become an industrial park now. Clean, quiet, efficient. But in the far corner stands something that doesn't belong to the present. A museum hangar with a single restored M4 Sherman, painted olive green, its steel polished until it gleams like memory. On its side, stenciled in white, are the words, "Built here, 1943. Inside, the air smells of oil and dust. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Beneath them, glass cases hold blueprints, rivet guns, lunch pails, letters home. Visitors walk slowly, whispering, as if afraid to wake something. The guide, a man no older than 30, gestures toward a black and white photo of women in overalls. "People think this place made tanks," he says. "It made something bigger. It made faith in doing the impossible." He taps the glass where the photo shows hundreds of faces smiling through grime. "These," he says, "were the people who built victory one bolt at a time." A speaker in the corner crackles to life. From it plays a digitized recording, Taken from an archival reel dated 1942, the factory whistle. The same one that once signaled dawn, danger, triumph. Its sound fills the room like a ghost clearing its throat. For a moment, everyone stops. Even the air seems to wait. Then silence again, heavy, but not empty. In the museum's small theater, visitors watch a short film, grainy footage of the arsenal during the war. Workers in goggles, sparks flying, tanks rolling off the line. A narrator's voice, distant and calm. Every bolt had a heartbeat. Every heartbeat, a name. Another clip shows women waving as a line of Sherman's heads toward the rail yard. The film ends with the same words that once hung on the wall above the main floor. Through labor, liberty. Outside, near the entrance, stands a bronze plaque. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, 1941 to 1996. In this place, the arsenal of democracy armed the free world. Fresh flowers, sunflowers and daisies, lean against the base. No one knows who leaves them, but they're always there. An old veteran of the factory, one of the last, comes here every spring. His name is Robert Burns, the same machinist who once called the arsenal our battlefield. He moves slowly now, cane tapping against the concrete. He stops in front of the Sherman, rests a hand on the cold metal, and whispers, "You still look ready." A museum volunteer offers him a seat. He declines. "I stood for 40 years in this place," he says softly. "I can stand a little longer." Before leaving, he signs the guest book. His entry is simple. "We didn't build war. We built time, the time others needed to live." The younger visitors read it later, puzzled at first, then quiet. At dusk, when the museum closes, the last beam of light catches the tank's steel surface and turns it gold. The sound of distant traffic fades, replaced by the faint hum of air conditioning, steady, rhythmic, almost like the pulse of a machine that refuses to die. Outside, the city still bears its scars. Detroit's skyline tells two stories, rise and fall, iron and silence. But here, on this small patch of ground, the past and the present meet without shame. War's end. Factories close. But the places that built victory never really stop. Because somewhere, in every engineer sketching the impossible, in every worker who refuses to quit, in every city that remembers what it once made, the arsenal still breathes. And somewhere, someone still believes. They can build the impossible.